This work, Active State, will, like Orders to Kill, will not be reviewed in the United States and any of the mainstream media. So it's nice to be in a place where there are friends present and there is some receptivity to the story, which, however sad it is and however indicative it is of the pervasive sickness of this, our native land. In a very real sense, this saga begins in Vietnam. I was a journalist there in 1966, and I traveled throughout the country until my presence became a bit intolerable. And I came back to the United States and then published. And Martin King read one of the articles that was written in a magazine called Ramparts. It's January 1967 issue of Ramparts called The Children of Vietnam. Some of you may remember it. It's an old San Francisco-based muckraking magazine. To understand the horror of Vietnam, the passion that one had to feel for that ancient land and those magnificent people, one has to resort to photographs to show what happened, and poetry, because prose is never sufficient. And Martin was moved by the photographs in that piece and eventually by the poetry that he had me recite to his congregation. And that poem was one that some of you may or may not have heard. It's, I come and stand at every door, but no one hears my silent plea. I stand and yet remain unseen, for I am dead. For I am dead. I am only 7, though I died in My Lai. Long ago, I'm 7 now as I was then. When children die, they do not grow. My hair was scorched by swirling flame. My eyes grew dim, my eyes grew blind. Death came and turned my bones to dust, and that was scattered by the wind. All that I ask is but for peace. You fight today, so that the children of this world may live and grow and laugh and play. Now the children of My Lai and their mothers and their grandparents were of course slaughtered one day in the middle of March, about the time that Bobby Kennedy decided he would declare for the presidency. On almost the very day he made his declaration, in March 1968, My Lai went on, only to be discovered by the Western world almost a year later. But My Lai was one village of hundreds. And when Martin King stumbled upon his January subscription to Ramparts at the Atlanta airport, as he was heading off to the West Indies, going through his post, and he came on these photographs, he pushed it away. Pushed away the food that was in front of him and the post that was in front of him and the magazine that was in front of him. And he froze. And Bernard Lee, his bodyguard, said, Martin, what's wrong? Was something wrong with your food? And he said, no, there's nothing wrong with my food, Bernard. I haven't tasted it, but I'll never enjoy food so long as this war continues. Now, he'd had the seeds growing within him for a number of years about this war in Vietnam. And he'd had the compassion growing within him for a number of years about the wretched of the earth and their plight when he was in India. And he saw poverty that he had never seen before. And he was inclined to oppose this war. But then all of a sudden it came together at the Atlanta airport. And he said he would have to do this. So he asked then to meet with me. And I opened the files to him on a first time on a car trip from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we were to preside over the opening of a Vietnam summer group. And as he went through the residue of materials, he couldn't contain himself and he started to weep. I remember that. So deeply was he touched by what we were doing to those people. And everything I'm telling you tonight about that experience all those years ago, remember, 36 years ago, I want you to think about today and what we were about to do once again. Because it doesn't seem as though the world has changed very much, at least not in these national boundaries. So he said then, right, I've got to now take this position, and I've got to formalize it. And that was, of course, to be done on April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day before he was killed. But he said, I'm going to lose all of the support I've had in the civil rights movement. All the leaders will walk away from me. And all of the media will start to condemn me. I will be called a traitor. And I will have no one to whom I can turn except perhaps my congregation and my brothers and sisters in SCLC. He said, but you know, Bill, I'm a little worried about my congregation because they know me as a pastor and as a civil rights leader. And now I'm coming into a realm of activity which is taking on the government of the United States that has done the most for civil rights in terms of legislation of any government in the history of this country. I'm having to take on the Johnson administration and opposing that war. And that's, my people are going to have a concern about that. So I want you to come down to Ebenezer Baptist Church, and I want you to take the pulpit, and I want you to speak to my people. And I want you to tell them why I have to oppose this war. And I thought he went round the bend. I said, you want this white kid from the north, I was just a little more than a kid, to come down and talk to your people, tell them why you have to oppose this war. What? And these are your people. You know, they might not even understand how I pronounce words. And he waved his finger in front of my face. I always remember this. And he said, no. He said, you've been there. You've seen it. You come and you tell them why their pastor has a moral obligation to oppose the actions of this government against this people. And I couldn't say very much more than that. I went down and I did speak that Sunday. Bishop Pike had been the guest preacher the week before, Bishop of California, and I don't know if I did any good, but at least I did what he asked me to do, as I usually did during the course of that last year, and that was the only year that I knew him, was that last year. Then, on April 15th, 1967, he spoke at the United Nations, in front of the United Nations at the Plaza, and came out forcefully against the war. Following this magnificent speech on April 4th, he spoke on April 15th. I introduced him that day. As agreed, I threw out for the first time the possibility that he should be pressed to run for the presidency of the United States with Benjamin Spock as his running mate, Dr. Benjamin Spock as his running mate, as an alternative to the Johnson war machine and the continuation of the administration. There was an overwhelming reaction, positive support to that suggestion, and Martin spoke to that assembled throng. Then we began to put together the National Conference for New Politics, and I agreed to run that last year, and that organization was the umbrella organization designed to make it all happen. It had a national convention in Chicago on Labor Day weekend, 1967. It was attended by 5,000 delegates from all over the United States. Every socioeconomic group was there. Every ethnic group in this country was represented. Every geographical area. It was the largest convention of people ever assembled in the history of this republic. And we were on the road, so we thought, to the nomination of that endorsement of that third party. So I introduced him as the keynote speaker and sat down, and as he was delivering the keynote address at the Palmer House in Chicago, I was passed a note. A note came over my shoulder, and I looked at it, and I read it, and it said, "Get him out of here after he finishes his speech, or we will take him hostage and humiliate him before the world." Now, who are the we? The we were a black caucus that had been formed prior to the convention, but were in the assembly, and as every black delegate came in, they were pulled into the black caucus room and made members of the black caucus, pressed effectively into service. And we thought this was a very good thing, because we thought that the blacks in America should have unified policy and concerted effort and attention being given to the problems both rural and urban blacks faced in America, and that this was healthy, and that the rest of the contingents who were there should look at the issues that were being raised. How naive we were, because we didn't know at the time that that group had been formed and led by agents provocateurs, which had been organized by the government of the United States, Department of Labor, Mayor Richard Daley's poverty program, and were led by the Blackstone Rangers, a Chicago gang. So their whole purpose then was to disrupt the convention, make sure that it was not successful, and we didn't have a clue how naive we were. And they did that, and they were successful. They pushed through resolutions that alienated one group from another, drove money away from the movement, and ensured the fact that we were starting from a very difficult point of view. So that was a sad lesson to learn, but we believed a lot of it at the time was unfortunate, but not malicious. And it was only years later that we would learn of the government involvement through Freedom of Information Act applications. Throughout that last year of his life, however, Martin King continued to campaign against the war and to try to relate to the problems of poor people. He was killed for two reasons. One was the opposition to the war, which was powerful and growing, and going to the bottom lines of major transnational corporations who were profiting from the war, both construction companies, oil and gas companies, as well as the armaments industries. They were the ones that were going to suffer from any kind of early end to this Vietnam adventure. And Martin King was developing a support throughout the country, particularly amongst white middle-class, northern liberal, Midwestern liberal folks who were tiring of this adventure. We brought 100 Vietnamese war-injured children to the United States in the course of that year, and they were placed in hospitals all over America for the purpose of getting restorative surgery from the various bombing effects and disfigurements and shrapnel wounds and things of that sort. Some of you who are old enough may remember photographs on posters and placards of children whose features were horribly disfigured because of the effects of the napalm in particular. Some of those photographs are mine, and some of those photographs are the reason that Martin King was moved in the first instance. So the war was a major issue. But the primary issue, I've concluded over the years, that he was taken out, had to do with a whole other set of values and a whole other orientation. It had to do with his commitment to the poor people of this republic. He had to commit himself to the redistribution of wealth, the reallocation of resources, so that the wretched of America would have a chance to live. Black, white, Indian, whatever ethnic background, whatever racial background, whatever geographical area, he was trying to forge that alliance. And that was what was critical. He was getting involved now in human rights issues that spanned the entire globe. He was no longer a civil rights leader. He was now a human rights advocate and a prophet. He had been moved by the wretched situation of the poor in India in 1960. He carried that with him, and now he was determined to do something about that in his native land. That was the ultimate goal. It was no good to have all these civil rights, you know. You could go to any restaurant you wanted to and eat in any restaurant you wanted to and go to any hotel you wanted to. What good was that kind of right if you couldn't afford it? That was the point. So you had to enable people to enable themselves to be able to afford it. And that required assistance from government. That required the restoration of programs that had been taken away and denied because of the war. So there was the grand project. He was going to bring masses of people to the nation's capital, and they were going to camp there. Not march, camp. They were going to live in a tent city in the shadow of the Washington Memorial. For as long as it took, they were going to go up the hill, visit their congressmen, their senators, and try to get these programs restored and try to get these funds placed back into the use of the people. That was the plan. That was the second reason why he was killed. Because the army believed he would not be successful. They believed that the angry mob of wretchedly poor people would get angrier, and they would get it beyond the control of this nonviolent, peaceful leader. And they would be taken over by militants who would lead a revolutionary force on the streets of the capital, the likes of which America had never seen. And America would have then its second revolution, a social revolution, for which it had been waiting for so long, for which Mr. Roosevelt had frustrated in the 30s with the New Deal programs. So they feared this would happen. Westmoreland wanted 200,000 more troops in Vietnam. They didn't have the troops for him. They didn't have the troops to put down that revolution. And because of that, Martin King was not going to be allowed to bring that mob to Washington. So those were the two reasons why he was killed. Now, he was assassinated on the 4th of April, 1968. As he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel at 6:01 p.m., a shot came from across the other side of Mulberry Street from an elevated position, struck him on a downward path here, exited here, came back in here, went down and lodged just below his shoulder blade, clipping his spine along the way. He fell, and he was eventually taken away to a hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital, where he died at about 7 p.m. The state moved very quickly to conduct an investigation, and they ultimately identified the assassin as one James Earl Ray. Said that he was a lone assassin. I'm not quite sure why he did it. Probably because he was a racist, or he was looking for money, and he was eventually arrested at Heathrow Airport and extradited to the United States. Now, the state's position from the beginning, in 1968 right to the present time, would you believe, to the present time, is that James Earl Ray acted alone for whatever his motives were. He bought a rifle in Birmingham, Alabama, carried it to Memphis, Tennessee, rented a room in this rooming house, which was just opposite the Lorraine Motel. Knew King was going to be there, went into the bathroom, waited until he showed up on the balcony, shot him, ran back to the room he rented, took all his belongings in a bag, and put the rifle in it, and ran down the stairs, out into Main Street, the main street of the city, turned left, started to run toward his car, saw a police car parked this way, drawn up to the sidewalk by the fire station, dropped the bundle in panic in a door, got into his Mustang, drove away, eventually went to Atlanta, parked the car in a housing development parking lot, and then made his way to Canada, and eventually made his way to the United Kingdom, and where after one trip to Portugal, he was trying to get to Africa. He was picked up and brought back to the United States. So James Earl Ray was the accused assassin. He was brought back, and he was imprisoned. He was held in Shelby County Jail, lights on for 24 hours, cameras on for 24 hours, under full surveillance. His lawyer was a man called Arthur Haynes. The Haynes father and son team defended him. Art Haynes was paid for his defense by making an alliance with a writer called William Bradford Huey. Huey had a contract with Look magazine, so Huey paid Haynes for giving him inside stories on the case. When James Earl Ray found out that information he was giving to Haynes, that Haynes was giving to Huey, was going to the FBI, who were visiting people whose names he was revealing, James got very uncomfortable with this whole arrangement, and he fired Art Haynes. And he brought on the Texas Tiger, Percy Foreman. And Percy Foreman began to represent James, and he was determined there was going to be a trial, and that's why he came on. And then lo and behold, at the last minute, virtually at the midnight hour, Percy said, James, you got to plead guilty. And you got to plead guilty because they got you convicted. The media's convicted you. They're going to fry your ass, he said. They're going to send your father back to Idaho. He violated parole there 50 years ago. They're going to send him back to jail. They're going to harass your family. And James, my health is not very good, and I can't give you your best defense. So I think it's better for you to plead guilty. James said that last reason was the one that really made him decide to plead. And Percy said, when you plead, that's all right. You hire another lawyer and you can overturn this guilty plea. You get yourself a trial and you'll get a lawyer who's healthy and fit, can represent you. James, I haven't got any money to hire a lawyer, Percy. He said, that's all right. Don't worry about that. I'll give you the money. I'll pay Jerry, your brother, $500. He can go hire a lawyer. Now, Percy not only told him this, he put it in writing. He put this in an actual letter. Dear James, I'm advancing you this money, $500, on the condition that you will cause no problems at the guilty plea hearing. So here's the lawyer, the man, talking him into pleading guilty and paying for him to hire a new lawyer. So James pled on March 10th, 1969. And on March 13th, 1969, he filed his motion papers for a new trial. And from March 13th, 1969, till the day he died in 1998, April 1998, he tried to get this trial that he never had. So, Judge Preston Battle was reviewing those papers on March 31st, 1969. Judge Battle was the judge of the case who had sentenced him to 99 years, accepted the plea, but he'd become a little concerned about some aspects of the evidence and some things that he hadn't been told. So he was taking his time in ruling on this motion. But on March 31st, 1969, his time was up because he died of a heart attack. He was found at his desk in his chambers with his head on James Earl Ray's motion papers. Now, under Tennessee law, when you die of a heart attack or any other kind of cause of death, and a motion is pending before you as a judge, the motion is automatically granted. There were 2 motions for a new trial pending for Judge Preston Battle when he died. And guess who did not get the trial? And guess who did get it? Well, James did not get it. And so he started his own pro se motions, and he had a variety of lawyers to try to help him get a trial over the years before I met him. When Martin was killed, I went to the memorial service in Memphis and the funeral in Atlanta with Ben Spock, and Bob Kennedy invited us to go up and have a word in his suite in Atlanta, and I think a number of my friends did go. I think Benjamin went, and Julian Bond and some others. I just decided I'd had it, so I didn't go. I'd known Bob Kennedy when I was a much even younger person, 64, when I handled his campaign, Westchester County. I was a citizens chairman. I didn't like him then. I didn't like his brother-in-law, Steve Smith. I didn't like any of the family. I thought he was opportunistic, arrogant, and didn't understand how the real world functioned, real people had to live. And that was my assessment of Bob Kennedy in 64 after working with him. But now I regret I didn't go see him in 68 because I think he was quite a different person. I think he had gotten out. I think he'd been to Mississippi. I think he'd seen people living under floors. And I think Bob Kennedy, who was assassinated, was really quite a different person. And so I have that regret. But in any event, I was finished with politics, and so I walked away. 9 years later, Ralph Abernathy called, and he said, "I'd like to go up and have you interrogate James Earl Ray in front of me so I can hear what he has to say." I said, "What do you mean you want to hear what he has to say?" I thought he'd gone around the bend. I said, "Isn't he guilty, Ralph?" I always thought, I never gave it a second thought. I thought they're the right guy. He pled, didn't he? I didn't know any of the story of the way he pled. And I said, "Well, I think I'd like to do this. Will you do it?" So I don't know anything about the case. It took me several months. It's like, it's find the time. I did research. Then we went to see James Earl Ray in August 1978. And I believed I was going to see a very aggressive, angry, racist guy who was very knowledgeable about weapons and who was probably very astute at being a con man. And so I was prepared for all of that. And brought a psychiatrist from Harvard who was a friend of mine, Howie Behrens. He was a body language specialist. He would sit in a corner, and as I battered away at Ray, he was supposed to watch him and see how he flinched, and what movements he made, and give me some indication of anxiety reactions, things of that sort. We did this for 5 hours, and I hit him very hard. And Ralph said this long prayer at the beginning, set the tone, then fell asleep occasionally throughout the 5 hours, as Ralph always did. I was on platforms with Ralph, and Martin was speaking, and Ralph would start to snore. And I'd end up hitting him in the ribs, like wake him up. You know, he just had this sleepy temperament, I guess I'd say. So anyway, we came away from that interview, and James had answered questions as directly as he could with a totally different view of this person. First of all, this was a guy who was painfully shy. He was quiet-spoken. If anything, he was docile. He wasn't aggressive. It emerged he wasn't a racist at all. When he worked in a shoe factory, he would shoot craps with the black workers after. He'd go to a bar with them. He hung out with black workers who were colleagues of his. He had nothing against black people. He knew very little about guns, and he was a very poor shot. His Army records were abysmal in terms of his ability with the rifle. And he was a petty stick-up guy who, when he was out of work, used to hang out in a bar, and somebody would come up with a good idea, and he'd fall in line with it. And he got in so much trouble by hanging out in bars and hearing these good ideas that he ended up spending a lot of time in jail. So he was incompetent. Even as a stick-up man, he was incompetent. He couldn't sometimes get to a supermarket on time to hold it up. By that I mean, not that it would be closed, but that the time lock would have been set on the safe. And he would come in after the time lock had already been set on the safe. And he'd go to the guy at the cashier and say, "Oh, now, why don't you get me that money from the safe?" I say, "Mister, the lock is set. There's nothing we can do about it. I mean, we'll give you our money, but there's nothing we can do about that time lock." And he would, "I don't want your money. I want the money in there." Yeah. So he was incompetent. He used to carry five bullets in a six bullet cylinder. And it took me years to get him to admit why he only had 5 rather than 6 bullets. When he was captured at Heathrow Airport, he had a gun and he had 5 bullets. And he said, finally, he admitted to me one time, he said, "Well, I used to always keep the firing pin cylinder empty." He said, "Because once I shot myself in the foot. That's embarrassing." So this is the nature of this guy. Who was an escaped convict and on the run, and who once, when he escaped from prison, he was aided by the falling asleep of a guard. And when there was an internal investigation, when they caught him, they brought him back and they put him up to try to find out how he escaped and how he managed to get out. He refused to testify against the guard, refused to tell on the guard. And I said, "Why'd you do that?" He said, "Well, you know, the reason he gave was, "Oh, I might need him again someday," or something like that. But he had this con mentality that he would not ever tell on anybody who he thought was legitimately trying to help him. And I think he was fooled very often in terms of who was trying to help him and who wasn't. So, but I could never quite bridge that. Anyway, we came away from that meeting with this man with a very different view. We came away with the opinion that he did not shoot Martin Luther King. We didn't know what other role he might have played, but we believed he didn't shoot Dr. King. But he raised enough questions in my own mind to let me be worried about what the truth really was, and be concerned about whether or not, in fact, we knew what happened to Martin King. And I thought it was important enough that this enormous figure was taken from us, this prophetic person was removed from us, and no one had ever taken his place, that at least we should try to find out what happened. So I started going into Memphis, Tennessee in 1978, 79, and it became like a slippery slope. And it continued for a quarter of a century. I never envisioned that it was going to take a quarter of a century, but it did. And from 78 to 88, I would go back to the prison and I'd visit James and I'd ask him questions, and then I'd set out again to Memphis and occasionally into New Orleans, because increasingly New Orleans was coming into the picture. And he kept asking me to represent him, and I said no for 10 years. It was kind of like being pursued, for 10 years, and I said no. Because I had to be convinced that he not only wasn't a shooter, but that he had no knowing role. And it took me 10 years to be convinced of that. And so in 1988, I agreed to represent him, and I started to handle his applications on appeal for a new trial. And I took this case all the way to the Supreme Court, and of course we lost every step of the way. So we were finished around 1991 in terms of the reasonable appellate route. I was living in England, moved to England with a young family in 1981. So I was conducting most of this work whilst living at Cambridge and coming back into America to do it. So there was a travel commuting burden in the way there as well. But we decided, come up with what we thought was a brilliant idea, to have a trial for James Earl Ray on television. It was called the television trial, Trial of James Earl Ray. It was sponsored by HBO, who were brought into the frame by Thames Television, a British production company. And it was telecast on HBO in the United States and on Channel 4 in England. Now, that trial took place over 10 days in 1993. It had Marvin Frankel, as a former federal judge, as the judge. Hickman Ewing Jr., who some of you may recall was Ken Starr's number 2 in the Whitewater investigation, was the prosecutor. And Hickman had won 200 consecutive cases as a U.S. attorney in Memphis. And I was defense counsel. And the jury came from all over the country. We tried that case with a fraction of the evidence that was later to emerge. It took the jury 7 hours of deliberation, a little over 7 hours, to come back and to find James Earl Ray not guilty. Tennessee criminal procedure rules applied. There were no scripts. It was a bitterly fought trial. The judge and I fought continually in chambers about evidence. And though he and I became friends later on, there was much contentiousness in the course of that trial. But you never heard about it. It was not reported, dropped from view, was called entertainment. The only thing we got from it was no further forward in terms of getting James out of prison, but new evidence. New witnesses came forward. Witnesses started to come forward. For example, James had always said he was controlled and moved around the country by a man called Raoul. Hickman Ewing said, Raoul reminds me of the story of the tooth fairy that my mother used to tell me. This is just another fantasy of James Earl Ray. There is no Raoul. James did. Well, there is a Raoul. There was and there is. He's still alive and well, protected by the government. He lives just outside of New York City, about 40 minutes from New York City. And when I go to one of my favorite Yonkers, New York Italian restaurants, I invariably go by Raoul's house just to see whose license plates are in his driveway. He's still there and alive and well. But Hickman said, no, he doesn't exist. However, an English merchant seaman said he does exist. English merchant seaman Sid Carthew used to come across to Montreal, and he met Raoul in the same bar that James met him in 1967. And Raoul tried to sell him some guns. And when Sid saw this on Channel 4 in England, and he heard Hickman going on about the Raoul thing, he got very upset and he contacted me. Then another woman contacted me from Mississippi. She had lived in Houston and she knew Raoul. She knew Raoul and she knew his cousin. And she knew him from taking arms shipments from Carlos Marcello coming around into the Gulf, repackaging them and selling them into Latin and South America. And she used to go down with them sometimes to the Houston docks and pick up these weapons and come back. And she knew Raoul because he raped her. Because one day she was there and she had a key ring that had the pictures of John Kennedy, Bob Kennedy, and Martin Luther King on it. And she put it down on the table where they were repackaging the guns. And one of the guys looked at it and threw it to Raoul, and he looked at it, threw it on the floor, and stamped it. Said, I killed that nigger once, looks like I'll have to do it again. Pulled out a gun and took Glenda Grabo into a bedroom on the first floor and raped her. Teach her a lesson, that she should have any affinity or fondness for any of these people. So Glenda knew him, having to leave Houston soon after, because when she went into Percy Foreman's office, who was a well-known criminal lawyer, of course, at the time, Percy was going to represent her husband's brother who had a criminal charge, and she saw memorabilia related to the Ray case in Percy's office. And she said, oh, you know something about that? He said, yes, I represented James Earl Ray. And she said, oh, you did? He said, yes. And she said, well, was he guilty? She said, well, no, not really, but it was a price that had to be paid, his conviction. Percy then developed a crush on Glenda and tried to get her to work for him. And so when this thing with Raoul came up, this incident came up, she actually went to him for advice, and he said, I think you and Roy should leave, because I know these people and I know Raoul. So Percy Foreman, James Earl Ray's lawyer, even knew the man who had been the controller of James Earl Ray. So Glenda came forward, told all this story finally. She'd held it in all these years. So we started to get this kind of evidence, but some of the most significant evidence was against a guy called Lloyd Jowers. Now Lloyd owned Jim's Grill, and Jim's Grill backed onto the Lorraine Motel, and it was the cafe on the ground floor of the rooming house which James Earl Ray rented a room on the instructions of Raoul. Okay, so Jowers was in a very strategic position. And all of a sudden we began to hear and get evidence about Lloyd Jowers. We had about 4 witnesses who would have caused him to be indicted if we could have gotten a grand jury to hear the evidence. And Lloyd knew that. So he said to his lawyer, Louis Garrison, go on over to the Attorney General, get me immunity from prosecution, and I'll tell everything I know about this case. So Garrison goes over and he talks to the District Attorney General, says, give my client immunity. You'll be the prosecutor of the century because he'll give you all the evidence on how Martin King was killed. Well, he was, to their surprise, not only did he not give him immunity, but nobody ever interviewed Lloyd Jowers from that office. They didn't want to know about it. But Lloyd was still worried because I sent a colleague of mine to sit outside the grand jury room. And every time the foreman came out, he said, look, we've got evidence we want to present to this grand jury. Will you let us in? We're trying to get that grand jury to be independent of the prosecutor. And I sat him there for 2 weeks, and this was not possible. But Lloyd didn't know it wasn't going to be possible. So he said, is there anybody who will let me tell this story on television? And he found a guy called Sam Donaldson. They found a guy called Sam Donaldson. Sam was a very unusual reporter at one point in time. And his kind of rapidly disappeared, including his own demeanor in terms of independence, I think. But anyway, he put him on a program called Primetime Live. That was Donaldson's program. And Lloyd told his story, basically, one evening, Primetime Live. What happened? The next morning, it was not covered anywhere. No print media, no television media. Not even ABC News covered this story the next morning. Their own program the night before, they didn't cover the story. It was totally squelched. Right? Well, why was Lloyd so worried? Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Lloyd was worried because he had a black lover named Betty Speights. And Betty Speights was a little bit suspicious of old Lloyd, and she thought that maybe he was fooling around with some other women from time to time. So she used to check up on him. So on that Thursday afternoon of April 4th, 1968, she came into the grill looking for Lloyd. And Lloyd wasn't out in the main area of the grill at all, and the kitchen door was closed, and that's suspicious. You know, that kitchen door is not supposed to be closed. So she goes and she opens the kitchen door, and she walks into the kitchen. Nobody's around, but the door leading out into the bushes in the back is open. Now, that's not the way it's supposed to be either. That's supposed to be closed. Outside door. As she approaches that door, she says, maybe Lloyd's out there fooling around in the bushes with some of these local women. Right? As she approaches that door, she hears a shot. And she stops. And then she continues, and she gets up to the door, and she looks out into the area of the bushes, and what does she see? She sees old Lloyd running, carrying a still smoking rifle. He brushes past her. His knees are covered with mud. His face is white as a ghost. He's out of breath. He rushes in, bends down and starts to break the rifle down, takes out the cartridge, and says to her, you wouldn't do anything to hurt me, Betty, would you? And she said, no, Lloyd, of course not. Throws the cartridge in the toilet, stops it up, covers the rifle with a cloth and takes it out and puts it under a the counter in the grill, where taxi driver James McCraw would be shown it sometime later, totally separately from Betty. Well, Betty kept that story from 1968 to April 1968 to December 1992 when she told it to me finally. Some of these people I had known for 15, 20 years before, as it would turn out, before they would eventually come out with their stories. And some of them had held these stories for, 30 years or so. They just held on to them, and they were afraid. They didn't talk. And if no one had been around, I suppose, to eventually listen when they were ready, then they would take them to their graves. But that's what has made this case really different than any other assassination case in history. I'll come back to that in a moment. So Lloyd Jowers then was a critical guy in this whole scenario. And his story basically was this. He was approached by a man called Frank Liberto, who was an associate of Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans crime boss. The Marcello family had taken a contract on the killing on Martin Luther King. Marcello came to, gave the contract to Liberto, who subbed it out. Liberto came to Jowers, whom he knew, and he said, we'll give you $100,000, plus I'll forgive an old debt that you have. And I eventually found out what that debt was. And you must help us with this, arranging this assassination. So Lloyd's place was used for the planning and the logistics of the assassination, and his job was really to hold the gun, the actual murder weapon, for a period of time during the day, turn it over to the people who were giving it to the shooter, and then take it back from the shooter and hold on to it and eventually dispose of it. So that was Lloyd's role. And the money came out of New Orleans. It was delivered to him in a vegetable box from one of the, actually not Liberto's warehouse, but another produce dealer. So that was Lloyd's story. In '78, when I first went into Memphis, I saw a man called Johnny McFerrin, one of the bravest men I've ever met. Johnny was a civil rights leader in Fayette County, black guy, still owns, garage and a little store out in Somerville, Tennessee, in Fayette County, which is the most racist by far of any county in Tennessee. Johnny's been shot at, beaten up, bones broken, hospitalized more times, attempted to be poisoned, and you can imagine. Not just because of the King case, but because he led voting rights demonstrations and registration drives in Fayette County for black people. When I went to see Johnny McFerrin, he agreed to see me because Reverend James Lawson asked him to talk to me. And Lawson was Martin's best friend in Memphis. I met him, the night I met him, his windows had been shot out in his garage, and he had this duct tape, he taped them up again. And we met in the back room of his garage with the lights out, and we sat about in chairs like these, about 6-8 feet apart, and he sat with a rifle between his legs the whole time. Other times when we continued the meetings, he insisted on meeting in a moving car. Wouldn't stay still in any one place. John told this story. On the day of the killing, he was in Frank Liberto's warehouse, produce place, getting produce items for his store, and pulling them off the shelf as he always did, and he'd go and he'd pay for them on the way out. He helped himself. And as he was pulling these various items off and filling his basket, he heard Liberto on the telephone. And Liberto was speaking in a very loud and angry voice, so he could hear him clearly, and he heard him say, "Shoot the son of a bitch when he comes on the balcony. And don't bring your ass around here and get down to New Orleans and pick up the rest of your money from my brother." Now, John knew Liberto was mob connected, so he thought it was something to do with him. It was only an hour later when he got back up to Somerville and he heard about Martin King being shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel that he realized what he had heard. So he eventually was convinced a few days later to tell his story to the Memphis Police Department detectives and the FBI, and they tried continually to break his story, change his story, and they couldn't. And he stuck with it from that day to this, and this is what he heard, and this is what he said. And I had heard that early on in '78. So years later, after the television trial, when Jowers was put in such a situation that he had to effectively tell us what he knew, it all sort of came together. After the television trial in '93, in March 20th or 21st, I think, there was an article in the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper, which brought in a whole other perspective that I never even dreamed of, and most Americans will be horrified about. That was the perspective that Steve Tompkins wrote about when he traced the infiltration of civil rights activists and movement leaders going back to the second decade of the 20th century after the Russian Revolution. At that point in time, the army believed that black people were natural recruitment targets for the Communist Party. And the Russian Revolution triggered extensive surveillance and monitoring of black community leaders all over America, including the family of Martin Luther King, Julian Bond, and others who were leaders in their communities. Steve took that story all the way through to Quantal-Pro in the 50s and the 60s, but in his article, there was one little paragraph that caught my eye, and it said that there was in Memphis, he didn't know anything really about the assassination, but he said there was in Memphis, Tennessee on the 4th of April, an Alpha 184 sniper unit, and nobody has ever explained why they were there. Now, that's all he said. So I went to see him, and I said, there was this unit. He said, yes, they were there. And you know who they were? And he says, I know who they were. And you know what they were doing there? And he says, I know what they were supposed to be doing there. And I said, will you get me access to some of the members of that unit? And he said, they'll never talk to you. Will you talk to them and because they'll trust you, because you know them already and you haven't betrayed them, take questions from them? He said, no. He kept saying no. Finally he said yes. And then this whole other dimension of the story came out, and we started to get this information about the unit. What they were was, they were a specialized assassinations team. They were special forces, all Vietnam experienced. 2 snipers and 2 spotters were the integral parts of the unit. They came out of Camp Shelby, Mississippi. They had a briefing at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. At that 4:30 a.m. morning briefing on April 4th, 1968, they were shown 2 photographs, one of Martin King and one of Andrew Young, and these were their targets. And they were to go to Memphis, Tennessee, and take up prearranged positions from rooftop buildings, and on orders they were to kill. They were to shoot Martin King and Andrew Young, and that was as simple as that. The briefing was over at 5, and they headed up toward Memphis. They took up their positions in the morning, and they stayed there all day. They had interactions with a couple of Memphis Police Department senior officers. In terms of, they were briefed by a lieutenant in the intelligence division before they took the positions, and they named all these people. And I knew who these people were anyway. And they were in position, but they didn't kill Martin King. They were a backup unit. I know they didn't know they were a backup unit, but they were. Martin King was killed from the bushes behind Jim's Grill by a Memphis Police Department officer who was a sharpshooter. And he was the man hired to do the job. And it was from him that Lloyd Jowers took the rifle. Now, there was a military task force in the city on that day that included the sniper unit, who didn't know that there were also photographers. Psychological operations team, 2 photographers were on the roof of the fire station, and they photographed everything. They photographed people on the balcony, people in the parking lot, and after the shot, he spanned into the bushes, and they got the killer just lowering his rifle. We negotiated for 2 years with the fellow who retained one set of those prints, who lives in Costa Rica, to try to get them. And my colleague used his name, unfortunately his real name, going in to Miami and on an airplane, and was followed by an FBI team out to the interview site. And they stood in a car about 100 meters away, and as he interviewed, he was talking to the psychological operations guy who had the prints. They put a big, long lens camera out the door of the passenger side, and the photographer saw it, and it spooked him, and he split, thought we were trying to set him up. So we didn't ever get those photographs. But there was that photographic team, there was the sniper unit, there were military intelligence people all over the place, there were Army, they call them ASAs, there were Army Security Agency people who tapped all the phones in King's in the motel room. They had his room and the rooms on either side of him bugged and tapped, and they had 3 folders, one for each room. So this was a concerted presence. It was a task force presence. And whilst it was not responsible for the actual murder, that was the mob job, and it was done. They were nevertheless there. So all this emerged from the television trial. People started to come forward. I published a book with this information called Orders to Kill in '95. That brought more people forward, more evidence started to come out. And unfortunately, we also learned at that point in time that James Earl Ray had liver disease from hepatitis C and was likely to die. So the family then was faced with the decision of what to do in these circumstances. And they decided overwhelmingly to come forward strongly and seek a trial for James Earl Ray. And that's what they did. And I told them when they decided to do that, they would lose money. As Martin King lost all of his contributions when he decided to oppose the war, they would lose money, they would lose followers, they would be demeaned by the media, they would be attacked by the media. I said, you must interview some witnesses. I want you to talk. I want you to see the evidence yourselves, so you're not being in a situation where people say you're being manipulated. And they said, you don't need to worry about that. You're like a member of the family. I'm in this curious situation of having been a friend of a victim, and having been the attorney for the man accused of killing the victim, and having been close to the family of the victim throughout, and eventually having become the lawyer for the family itself. I don't know if a lawyer has ever been in quite that kind of situation before, and I couldn't have been in it if I thought I had the slightest bit of conflict, but I didn't, because all of our interests were the same. The families and Ray's were the same, was proving his innocence so he could get a trial. They came forward for a trial. They were attacked. We were close to a trial at one point. Judge Joe Brown, whom you know probably as a television judge now, or some of you may, was the criminal court judge in Memphis, Tennessee, who for a period of almost 4 years presided over the wrangling of our efforts to get this trial. And as he was, I think, on the verge of granting the motion, finally, the state made an application that he should be removed from the case because he had become prejudiced. Went up to the Court of Appeals. They didn't allow a hearing. They simply ruled he was taken off the case. When they took Joe Brown off the case, that effectively stopped the possibility of a trial. Of course, we lost that. James was going to die and needed a liver transplant. I arranged a liver transplant for him at the University of Pittsburgh Hospital. He met all their criteria and they agreed to accept him. I made an application to the court in Tennessee and was denied. Even though it wasn't going to cost the state anything, they nevertheless decided they didn't want to let James Earl Ray have that liver transplant. That was equivalent to signing his death warrant. So all of the efforts of the family and legally and we did were met with these kinds of roadblocks throughout the case, and all of the new evidence that was revealed was just totally ignored. And James Earl Ray died in April of 1998 in prison without ever having his trial. And we met in Atlanta and said, family said, where do we go from here? What is this? What can we do about this? And I suggested a wrongful death civil action against Lloyd Jowers because we had enormous evidence against him. And they were torn because they'd been attacked so much. They said, is it really worth it? And finally, Coretta King made the decision, yes, we're going to do it. She said, I always think when we have difficult decisions like this, what would Martin do and what would Martin have had me do? And the children were arguing, oh, it's going to be more hassle or it's going to be so difficult, and they're agonizing over it. She just cut through it and she said, Bill, we're going to trial. Boom, that was it. And that shut them up, of course. And of course, then they came enthusiastically on board and supported the mother's decision. So we went to trial. We filed the action in '98. We tried the case in '99. We got a judge who was going to retire after this case, a black judge. So he had a reputation for being reasonably independent, and he was now going off the bench, James Swearingen. So we started this case on November 10th, 1999, and the trial lasted 30 days. There were over 70 witnesses, and all this evidence was put under oath. It went on and on and on. And the jury took 59 minutes. And they came back and they found for the King family and against Lloyd Jowers, apportioning liability for him 30% and 70% of the liability to agents of the government of the United States, state of Tennessee, city of Memphis. Thank you. 59 minutes it took that jury. And you know, you probably never heard about that trial. Because the media sat in the hallway. Except when Miss King testified, or Dexter or Andrew Young, they sat in the hallway. One of my friends is general counsel of Court TV. And he said, this is so important, we're going to cover it live every day. And he was so embarrassed when he was overruled at the senior filtering level. So there was a window of about 12 hours where there was some reporting of what happened, and then it just ended. And anything you heard thereafter was a criticism of the judge. He fell asleep, or the jury was falling asleep, or there were a variety of reasons. But the trial is a historic event. There are 4,000 pages of testimony that's up on the website of the King Center, it's the kingcenter.com website. And those 4,000 pages are there for all history to read. I've summarized them in Act of State. But the reason it's so important is never before in the history of these kinds of events has it been possible, going back to ancient times, has it been possible to put in some kind of judicial proceeding under oath all of the evidence related to the killing of a major figure. That's what separates this from everything else that's happened. And I'm sad to say it's of little use to the American people because they don't know about it, but at least it's there in terms of historical interest, and it's there for you to tell your children about and their grandchildren about, and nephews and nieces and other loved ones and friends, because otherwise it doesn't go anywhere. It's a valuable case history for how governments work, how governments proceed, how governments remove opposition and end dissent. And the importance of dissent should be so clearly established in our framework today. In these times, where you have a mentality of anxiety and patriotism that's being stressed to such an extent because of this threat of terrorism that has been created, anyone who is dissenting is looked upon, as Martin King was looked upon, as a traitor. So that it's important that activity be enhanced John Adams said that dissent is the highest form of patriotism. Long have we forgotten that, but we must keep that up. This kind of case stresses the worst that government can do. Now, this is not just the government of this republic. This is all governments. Salisbury was Prime Minister of England. He tried to set up Victoria to be assassinated, but then set up 2 IRA guys to do it, caught the IRA guys, blocked the assassination, and then went after the IRA. This goes on. Augustus Caesar spent 1 whole year using a public relations campaign to vilify Mark Antony so that he could create public support for the war against Mark Antony and the march on Egypt. I mean, and this little wimpy guy, Augustus, was brilliant at what he did. And eventually he whipped Rome. It took him a year to do it because Mark Antony was the greatest warrior in the history of Rome. So there are historical precedents that go on and on. But we live here and now, and this is our native land, so we should be concerned about what these latest empirical figures are trying to do. You know, the Northwoods Plan should teach us. How many know about the Northwoods Plan? Huh? We have a handful of people who know about the Northwoods Plan. Northwoods Plan was devised by Admiral Lemnitzer in 1959. And he, after the Cuban Revolution, developed this plan for the killing of American citizens on the streets of America by special forces soldiers disguised as Cubans for the purpose of justifying an invasion of Cuba. This is not a fantasy. It's a horror story, isn't it? So horrible, you don't want to believe it. It's now been released. The documentation under the 40-year rule was released. It's been published by James Bamford in a book called Body of Secrets. It's historical fact undeniable. This is what the government was going to do. This is what Lemnitzer was charged with doing. So this young guy comes in as president, Jack Kennedy, and he sees this scheme. He says, "What are these guys nuts? This is crazy." You know, in his incredible naivete, you know, Kennedy couldn't believe that there were people who would think like this and do these things. But these are the forces who run the country. And if you are a president or elected public official and you don't go along with these forces in the shadows, they will find ways of getting rid of you. I mean, I don't need to tell you what's happened to Cynthia McKinney and others, and the campaigns that have been waged against people. And Russ Feingold probably is next on the list because he was the only senator to vote against the Patriots Act. So the King case emphasizes, allows us to focus on all of these things. He was never replaced. And because he was never replaced, there has never been an effective movement to accomplish the goals for social change that he embodied and he was committed to toward the end. So they were successful. They've kept the lid on for so long. But it may at last be coming to an end. There may be that possibility to take what he called a neighborhood that we have created and make into it a brotherhood. It may be possible to take those means, which he said are unimproved means. I always reverse that. He said we have improved means to reach unimproved ends. It may be that we can switch those things around, and psychically I keep trying to do that with the anti-globalization movement and now the anti-war effort. Perhaps now the seeds of movement again are beginning to grow in this land. If not, I'm afraid that this great republic is on the way to fascism. I see the door to fascism now opening wider every day. And it's difficult to think of how one can stop it. Mr. Jefferson said there was a way. He said every 20 years, the way is to cleanse the body politic with a revolution. Now, how wise is Mr. Jefferson? Well, When Jack Kennedy had all the Nobel Prize winners for dinner at the White House, he raised a toast to them. And he said, never before has there been so much brilliance seated round this table for dinner, except when Mr. Jefferson dined alone. I think Mr. Jefferson's wisdom, at least in this respect, is with us still today. And how long it will take before we have an implosion remains to be seen. But in the neighborhoods and the communities of this land, if people organize and start taking control of their own destinies and build their own networks, at least there may be a force in the heartland of America ready to rise when the time is right. Thank you.